fallen or rolled into the track, been blown in, or as a car passed. And so if there was a slight little angle in her foot due to, say, a callus on the outside edge of her heel there that caused a slight angle right along there, those bits of dust have just lined up because that's a breaking point in the contour of the bottom of the foot. Okay, so just an alternate hypothesis to consider. Okay, now here's a little gift that I grabbed off, and I can't give credit because I can't remember where I got it, but it was on the BFF, which I almost never visit. It shows that little artifact, but the person posting this suggested that, if you look at this one first, that here you can see the heel of a boot. Here's the heel of the boot, here's the outline of the boot up here. But then one of the respondents said, well, yes, I can see that, but in this imprint, here's the big toe, and here's the outline of a foot showing through the rubber sole of Patty's costume. Now, puzzle me this. How do you have a costume that has a foot that's flimsy enough for a foot or a boot, take your pick, from one step to the next, pushing through a rubber-soled fake foot, and yet it's rigid enough that a 600 to 800 pound of necessity weighted subject can push those footprints an inch and a half into firm, moist sand on the Bluff Creek sandbar. I mean, do these people actually think through the consequence of their arguments? Every once in a while, someone will say, Jeff, go look on Randy's, what is it called? Randy's forum, can't remember. Pardon? Yes. And there's a few people who, thankfully, I don't know who they actually are. Willie Parcher and Kid Kazi.
Oh, yeah.
My goodness. Get a whole life. I was surprised when I saw this online, John. I thought this was our secret. He told me not to tell anybody about these things. It's probably better if I didn't discuss these, but on one of my visits, he took me down to the lakeshore at Harrison, and he pulls out of the bag this pair of footprints, which he had constructed to conduct experiments. It's like, this is the unfortunate thing. Paul Freeman got a really, in large measure, a bad rap. I'm not saying that everything he did was above reproach, but he one time publicly acknowledged that he had experimented in his backyard what it would take to fabricate a footprint so he could better evaluate. And his rationale, so he could better evaluate footprints in the field. And most of us that are good researchers when it comes to footprints have done similar types of experimentation of our own as well. But as a result of that, he was labeled as a hoaxer. And so John was very concerned that this type of research might be used as fodder for accusations of hoaxing. But he had this pair of feet, which are made out of fiberglass, and then fiberglass to a pair of old sneakers, very uncomfortable to put on. And then he had another pair that were carved out of wood they looked like those shoes they make today with the rocker bottom. And they were carved out of wood and had just simple leather straps, of the sort that Wallace claims to have done all his fabricating with. Went down to Harrison Lake, to the lake shore, and we were doing a couple of experiments, and on that firm sand, it wasn't even a mark, visible. I mean, a couple little tiny indentations under the toe, and if you really angled your foot up, you could barely make an indentation at the margin. So John has these feet on his over his shoes or over his feet, and he says, "Come jump on my back." I said, "Don't you mean you jump on my back?" He said, "No, come on, jump on my back." And so here I am. I jumped on, 200 pounds about that time, jumped on his back, and so with our combined weight, and he goes traipsing across the sand. had with my pair of fake feet sticking out to the sides. And we're trying to make sure no one was watching. No one was watching when we went to the upper end of the beach. But even with 400 pounds, it didn't hardly make discernible tracks. I mean, nothing by comparison to the tracks that John witnessed and photographed. Even in dry, and especially in dry sand, there would be no indication whatsoever. And yet here we can see tracks that were from that same time period photographed on the Bluff Creek sandbar itself, and instead of the road beds up above. Okay. Then one time when I was rifling, when John was allowing me to rifle through some of his files and look at things and duplicate pictures and whatnot, I came upon these shots. And these were original photographs that he'd received from Don Abbott that had been taken during Don's visit. Now this also, right off the bat, I mean, look at the texture of that soil and so forth, and yet those footprints are imprinted. I can't imagine that kind of detail and that depth of imprint with, I mean, it's one thing to argue that maybe on a dusty road on the soft shoulder, you know, you could get the indication of a artifice, a fake carved foot leaving a good imprint. But in that kind of textured soil, it's hard to imagine. But this is the kicker. This was the third photograph. Now I want to be absolutely sure that you're seeing what I'm seeing, so I'm going to give you help there. This is what I refer to as a half track. So here on the Blue Creek Mountain Track is a good example of where either its step was a little longer than a normal walking step, or it was striding out or running a little bit. But there's absolutely no indication back here of imprint, and yet, if you've seen in my book, when you overlay that, you can overlay that very well to one of the previous ones, and it breaks it right with appropriate proportionality to coincide with the mid-tarsal break, with the transverse tarsal joint. And I'm going to stop saying break because I've had some protracted conversations with a couple of individuals, and I won't name anyone in particular, but who always seem to fall into the mindset that a break refers to some dysfunction, some degeneration of the foot, where it has broken down rather than describing simply an axis of flexion that allows for movement in a range of motion that our foot is constrained. Okay, so you've all seen these pictures. You can see this is Rand Mullins with his original, and what I want to emphasize here is the look of the carved feet, the typical carved feet. And this one is quite honestly very primitive, very square feet, toes straight across the end of the foot, no toe angle whatsoever, and the toes being only very crudely rounded. Wallace even criticized these, said, "Oh, nobody can be fooled by those," and in print in the newspaper. And so here's Wallace's. Now this photograph, as I understand, was taken in Toledo, Washington, which is after Wallace went back to live in his home state of Washington. He was in California on contract work doing the road construction. But these are the typical, stereotypical tracks that Wallace produced. Again, the Easter egg toes in a straight line, the highly exaggerated split ball, the bulging, medial side of the foot, and the really relatively narrow heel breadth, except for the little squat ones that look very distinctive, that look like they've been cinched around the waist and things bulging out all over. Here's a close-up just to show you again. This is, in fact, probably one that was figured in the figure that Chris had put together. So, take a good look at that. And then ask yourself, what was the inspiration? What prompted him to suddenly, or somebody, whether it was them or whether it was the heirs, whether it was one of the nephews or so forth, or sons, to come forward with this pair of footprints? Well, I think I know what the inspiration was. It was that these were made after the fact. They weren't the producers of the footprints, but they were made after the fact. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the 13-inch tracks. Now this is such a stunning picture because of its clarity, but unfortunately it's one of those situations where the remarkable clarity is like when Roger Patterson produced or cast his 2 footprints. He picked the flattest, clearest examples he could find, and they looked remarkably non-dynamic. And because they were so flat and archless and featureless, otherwise all the toes are remarkably well preserved. The anatomy's there. It's a great mold of the foot, but it's not a very dynamic step register, and that precipitated a lot of criticism. Same way with this. You know, Chris Murphy did a really nice little expose talking about how it is that this part right here between the toes and the forefoot looks completely undisturbed. Would this be the result of a stiff foot with carved, very curled toes, the tips of which impressed but left the intervening there undisturbed? You know, and that is curious. I think some of it can be explained with that little example I just showed you, that by tightly curling the toes, they tend to line up more. The size of the tips is a little less differentiated, especially here at the great toe in this younger individual, presumably. But otherwise, I mean, it looks very natural. There's there's tension cracks surrounding it that suggests a nice even footfall. There's no impact cratering or ridging around it. Even the details, the contour of the flexion crease there looks very, very natural. It doesn't look like a stereotyped contour that Wallace's footprints exhibit. And then when you consider the multiple casts that are made of the 13-inch, you can see a lot of variation. You can see toes here that are much more extended, with evidence of toe stems present there. And even over here, the great toe has a little more continuity. There's a little artifact there, or not artifact, but a little jumble in there that might be obscuring the detail. I went to the wrong spot, right over here. Okay, this was one that, on the far end, is one that's down in Al Hodgson's collection that he was given by John on the occasion of those casts being done. And here's the opposite side. Again, look at the one on the left. The toe stem for the great toe is more obvious there. There isn't an unbroken ridge of material across. So again, when you take a step back, if you don't become myopic and focus on one feature, if you take a step back and look at the big picture, the variation that's present suggests a very natural, very dynamic footfall, evidenced in the whole composite. Now this is another one I grabbed offline. This one compares Al Hodgson's cast, which has been multiply replicated and dispersed. I mean, it pops up all over the place, and there's some interesting stories where it's been at the root of some attempts to hoax evidence. And then again, comparing it to the Wallace, and yeah, it looks pretty similar. And then comparing it to one of the Blue Creek Mountain tracks here. Now, one of the things that has caused some people to take exception to Al Hodgson's as possibly being fake is this remarkably squared off toe, which seems to echo the unnaturally squared off toe over here in the Wallaces. And look carefully. Now notice really carefully the sharp lines here and the incomplete differentiation of the little toe. Here is a photograph of the original of Al's cast, which I photographed in en face, straight en face on the right. Here turned about a third of the angle there, a quarter angle maybe say. But the point is, you can see that the original cast has the stain from the soil in which it was cast. But there's this bright spot right up here. And in fact, there is, we were talking about it last night. I honestly, at the moment, can't remember if that is an indentation or if it's sticking out. Because it was suggested that perhaps there was a stick or some twigs, as was evidenced in